Video guide on assembling of axle boxes equipped with EPK bearings. Assembling of axle boxes equipped with radial bearings, cylindrical roller bearings, type WJ 130 by 240 TNC4 and WJP 130 by 240 TNC4, manufactured by AO EPK Saratov. Instruction. We perform assembling in closed and well-lit room. The room must be free of any vapor penetration, corroding chemicals, and dust. The constant temperature must be not less than plus 15 degrees centigrade and must not exceed plus 25 degrees centigrade, with relative air humidity of 60%. Any manipulations with bearings must be carried out in dry rubber gloves in order to avoid corrosion, degradation of lubricant properties, and to prevent contact with abrasives such as sand, ground, rock dust, and destructive oils. In order to ensure the accuracy of all measurements, bearings and measuring instruments should have the same temperature as the ambient medium. The wheel set axle neck is to be cleaned with soft cloth before mounting. Nicks, cracks, and other mechanical damage of the axle neck are not allowed. Diameters of the wheel set axle neck are to be measured in 3 sections in 2 mutually perpendicular planes, that is, in 6 dimensions. Measurement results are to be recorded in the certificate. Then, the out of roundness and taper parameters of the wheel set axle neck are measured. Axle box preparation.
Before the installation of the axle box, the front cover, the labyrinth rings and the mounting parts should be properly washed and dried. The technological process of the user applies at this stage.
Out of roundness limit of mounting surface is 0.023 millimeters. Taper limit of mounting surface is 0.023 millimeters. Diameter limit of the mounting surface is 240 plus 0.045 millimeters. Bearing preparation. After packaging is open, the presence and content of the individual bearing passport are checked for compliance with manufacturer's requirements, as well as the bearing marking and the absence of corrosion and mechanical damages. Bearings that have not passed the visual inspections are not to be permitted for further assembly. Geometrical limits. Measured parameters. Inner ring hole diameter 130 millimeters minus 0.025 millimeters. Radial bearing clearance of 0.145 up to 0.190 millimeters. Axle bearing clearance of 0.070 up to 0.150 millimeters. Assembling of labyrinth rings and inner rings of the bearing.
The inner rings also have to be heated up to 100 to 120 degrees centigrade with all the surfaces carefully prepared before the installation.
Heating can be performed in electrical furnace using an induction heater or in an oil bath, where transformer oil is used as the heating liquid. The 4-wheel seat of the axle is covered with a thin layer of special grease. The heated labyrinth ring is installed using a special mounting sleeve. In mounting, the labyrinth rings rest against the end of the 4-wheel seat of the axle. Before the mounting of the inner rings onto the axle neck, inner rings are heated up to temperature of 100 to 120 degrees centigrade. If heated in an electric furnace, temperature control is performed by a contact thermometer in the area of inner ring mounting. The wheel set axle neck is to be covered with a thin layer of special grease. Heated inner rings are mounted onto the axle neck in the following order. First, the inner ring of the rear bearing WJ 130 by 240 TNC4 is put on with the board forward. Then, the ring of the front bearing WJP 130 by 240 TNC4 is put on so that its side with a bevel from the rollaway directs to the WJ 130 bearing ring. The special match marks on the bevels of the inner rings of the bearings must be aligned. After installation of the inner rings, the axle neck is fitted with a flap stop cover and the inner rings are tightened with M20 screws with torque of 200 to 300 newtons per meter. The tightening torque should be double checked. Tightening of the inner rings with any hammer or other striking force is strictly prohibited. Use of technological end plates and bolts is permitted. As the rings cool down, the bolts are to be tightened again. The inner rings must be kept in a tightening state until the rings and the axle neck cool down to the ambient temperature. It is allowed to keep the rings in tightening state to a temperature of no more than 30 degrees centigrade. Tightness, or the gap between the rear and the front inner bearings and the inner bearing ring to the labyrinth ring, is carried out with a feeler. In this case, the temperature between the inner rings, the labyrinth ring, and the axle neck is allowed to be no more than 3 degrees centigrade. The filler plate with a thickness of 0.03 millimeters can enter the gap between the parts on a section of no more than 1/3 of the circumference. If this requirement is not fulfilled, the gap between the rings is more than 0.03 millimeters, the whole set of rings should be dismounted from the axle. Mounting of axle box and the outer ring.
The outer rings are then installed into the axle box. It is done in such a way that the WJ bearing faces its front side to the back side of the axle box, and the WJP bearing faces its front side to the front side of the axle box.
Grease is put into the bearing between the rollers along the entire inner diameter into the grooves of the labyrinth ring and into the spaces between the labyrinth ring and the rear bearing. Any consistent grease can be used. The amount of the grease is 300 grams per axle box. The axle box with installed bearings is mounted onto the inner ring set assembled on the axle. In doing this, a special guide sleeve is used, which is attached to the end of the axle by M20 screws. The axle box with bearings is first installed onto the guide sleeve and then gently pushed on the set of rings, with rotation of 45 degrees in different directions. The flange ring of the front WJP 130 by 240 TNC4 bearing is mounted with marking facing the front side of the axle box. The end plate, protective cap, and 3 end M20 screws are installed onto the wheel set axle neck. The tightening torque for M20 screws should be 200 ± 10 Newton per meter. The torque must be double checked. The tightening of the screws must be carried out steadily. The tightening torque should be checked by a torque wrench. After the screws are tightened, the wing of the protective plate are bent to the side plate of each bolt head. Front cap mounting. The rubber seal is put on cylindrical end cover of the front cap. The front cap is installed into the axle box and fixed with 4 M16 screws with new spring end caps installed under them. The tightening of M16 bolts must be carried out steadily. To do this, its tightening is performed diagonally with subsequent retightening in the reverse order. The tightening torque should be checked by a torque wrench. Tightening torque of M16 bolts should be 100 ± 10 Newton per meter. Control of axle clearance and axle box rotation easiness. Control of easiness of axle box rotation is performed by rotating of the axle box about the wheel set axis in different directions to the angle of 45 degrees. In this case, rotation should be smooth without jerkings, seizing, and abnormal noises. The axle clearance in the axle box is to be measured. To do this, a magnetic stand with dialog gauge is used. The axle box is moved about the wheel set axis from one extreme position to the other. The reading of the gauge is written down. The difference between the indicator reading is the value of the axle clearance. Axle clearance limit in the axle box is 0.68 to 1.38 millimeters. The lifetime of the bearing is 8 years or 1,200,000 meters in the axle box of a passenger car.